among the luminous names of India's extraordinary Bhakti movement that arose around the 6th century and flourished until about the 16th century, one name that enjoys both literary and philosophical superstardom is that of Kabir, and perhaps the only name that has brought to bear decades of scholarship on Kabir's enduring writing and philosophy with manifest success, and in the process become a star witness himself, is that of Dr. Purushottam Agrawal. Dr. Agrawal began studying Kabir in 1979 and got his PhD in 1985 on the theme of social meaning of Kabir's Bhakti under the supervision of Professor Nambar Singh, one of India's most respected linguists, theoreticians, and literary critics. Throughout his adult life as a poet-philosopher in the mid-15th and the 16th centuries, Kabir was a widely revered figure with his folksy wisdoms distilled from a variety of scriptural and literary sources. One of the most extraordinary aspects of his life was that he was born in a Muslim family, but he was claimed as their own by both Hindus and Muslims with ever-increasing vehemence and enthusiasm. So much so that famously there was a raging dispute after his death whether he should be buried under the Islamic tradition or cremated under the Hindu tradition. Although Kabir's wisdoms are nearly 5 centuries old and some even obscurantist, many of them resonate in the current times as strongly as they did during his era. And that prompted me to begin my interview of Dr. Purushottam Agrawal with this question. I want to begin by being deliberately provocative. Kabir's period was from the mid-15th century to the 16th century. Essentially, what he wrote as poetry and distilled wisdoms in verses is about 5 centuries old now. What does it say about Indian society's evolution that those wisdoms not only seem relevant now, but perhaps even more so? And I ask because shouldn't we have outgrown as a society some of those instructions that he made under particular circumstances?
Yeah, that's a very important question. But before answering that, let me just remind you from my book that we should never try to impose our times on Kabir's times and vice versa. Because there is a historical distance of 500 or 600 years, which cannot be bridged by anybody. We have learned a lot. Certain things are taken for granted by us, which were beyond the imagination of Kabir. I mean, for example, he could not have imagined that somebody from his native Banaras could travel to Delhi in 60 or 70 minutes flat.
Right.
Or somebody sitting Sar Samandar Par, as they would say, in Chicago, will be talking to someone in Delhi like this, almost face to face. So these differences are there, of course, and also this whole idea of democracy and all that. But at the same time, let us also recognize, Mayank, that things go on changing and growing and evolving, but certain issues remain and they come back again and again. For example, to take a very recent example, after the First World War, it was supposed to be that this century is going to be free of any large scale wars now. And in less than 30 years, we had another war, another world war.
Right.
Then there are many people, for example, like Steven Pinker, who claim that after Second World War, there has not been a major conflict in the world. The problem with this observation is this, that the world is taken to mean only the North Europe and America.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, after 1945, there was the partition Holocaust in India, in which millions of people were slaughtered. The Palestine problem, the Palestine-Israel conflict continues unabated for last 70 years plus, and so on and so forth. And most of these trouble spots are, so to say, the result of almost deliberate attempt of shifting all the violence, all the war from north to south.
Right.
So now there is a proxy war between European powers, but the theater of war is Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So, similarly, yes, Kabir was talking of uh, dead ritualism. Kabir was talking of lack of rationality. He was talking of communal strife and conflict. And at times it seems that since, as if we have outgrown these things. At times it seemed.
Right.
But well, things come back in different forms, in different avatars, and with different kind of emphasis. So I think this basic search for to to take a expression from a rather unusual context, the search for final solution is not good in any sphere of activity.
Well, talk of provocation, then you just did it.
Well, you see, I am famous or notorious for being provocative myself. So I
Absolutely.
enjoy being provoked and being
Yeah.
provocative.
Yeah. Early on in your book, you make a sharply observed point that Kabir did not treat enlightenment as a static achievement or
Yes.
a momentary flash, but a constant process. Would
Yeah.
you care to elaborate? Because the idea that enlightenment is an ongoing process is quite remarkable.
Before answering this question, let me really, really put my great admiration for you on record.
Oh, how
And let
nice
me
of you.
thank you for this because you are the first person talking formally. Informally, people have mentioned this. But so far as formal conversations or reviews are concerned, you are the first person to notice that.
Thank you.
And I have been thinking about it sometimes in an amused mood, sometimes in a depressed or rather angry mood. That here is a statement which, to my mind, is quite significant and is one of the most fundamental statements made by the book, and nobody has even noticed it.
In
So I'm
fact,
very
to me,
happy about it.
that is the fulcrum of everything.
Yeah, that's why I'm very happy about it that you raised this question. See, we know from our own experiences, and the question you are asking is directly related with this. While making this statement, I have also made the point that in history, we see certain historical moments as moments of enlightenment. For example, the 18th century Europe, the Enlightenment. For example, for people like me and some others, the 15th, 16th century, the phenomenon of Bhakti movement. This is also some kind of enlightenment in the context of Indian society. But even in case of societies and such large entities, the enlightenment is not something which happened and it's over. The process has to go on. So far as individuals are concerned, we know from our own experience that it is not as if, I have written in this, it is not as if that Buddha got enlightenment at one point of time and it's over.
Right.
I mean, maybe this is true of people like Buddha or Mahavira or people like that. But so far as people like me and you are concerned, we have to constantly observe and watch for the process of enlightenment. It has to be sustained by perseverance. Because sometimes it so happens that we do and say things which probably after a moment or some time we would realize that they were not probably correct.
Right.
So, this constant awareness, along with enlightenment, I have also made a point in this book, which I think you must have already noticed. I have said that moksha is not a kind of final liberation.
Yeah.
To my mind, moksha is a kind of constant self awareness.
Right.
And therefore, moksha is not a state of bliss to be enjoyed after death,
Right.
because after that, nothing remains except memories. I'm very clear about it. I do not believe in any kind of afterlife in a literal sense. Metaphorically, yes, we do live in memories of others. But if I really want to enjoy moksha, then it has to be the moksha in the sense of self awareness. What am I? What's my place in this society? What's my place in this whole huge cosmos?
Right.
And how insignificant I am, or how significant I am. At a certain level, I'm very significant to my family, to my friends, to those who love me. And at another level, क्या है यार, क्या औकात है आपकी?
बिल्कुल
In the
बिल्कुल
galaxy and ever expanding universe, where do you stand? so, so This apparently contradictory realization is what I call the crux of self-awareness.
Right.
This self-awareness to me is the enlightenment. And this enlightenment has to be preserved by regular praxis,
Okay.
not only in theory but also in practice. You have to preserve it, you have to work on it constantly. That is what
That's
I say when I say that
right.
enlightenment is not a moment which happens and then
Right.
all good. You live
Yeah.
happily ever after. No, you have to constantly go on working on it.
Another remarkable point you make on behalf of Kabir is that he does not separate jog, or the blissful union with the ultimate with bhog, a sort of hedonism. His conception that bhakti is both jog and bhog. Talk a bit about that.
See, basically, here we have to understand the context of Kabir. Kabir was working in a context in which there was a lot of influence of Nathpanthi yogis.
Yeah.
They were yogis and they insisted on renunciation. They insisted on very strict self discipline and they claimed to achieve miraculous supernatural powers due to that self discipline. If you read Kabir, and I have quoted a couple of verses to that effect, he actually ridicules such claims. The
Right.
claims of supernatural miraculous powers. He criticizes them and he ridicules them. The point he is making in that particular poem and at many other places that this idea of renunciation leading to the spiritual bliss is actually a euphemism given to escape. Escape from your worldly existence. Escape from your real life. See, Kabir has not said this, but I am saying this. What is the great fun or great bravery in being integrated, honest, while you do not have to interact with other human beings?
Right.
Or you have to interact with them from a superior position. When you don't have to run your household, how do I know that actually you are honest or not?
Exactly.
When you do not have the family, how do I know that whether you are human with women or not, or with children or not, or with neighbors or not? If you do not hold a public position or a powerful position, how do I know that you are really committed and devoted to the job and are not using it for the personal benefit and pleasure? So, unless you are in the challenges of real life, your claims of great ethical achievements are really not very impressive so far as I am concerned. The
Remarkable.
point
Yeah.
Kabir is making is there that there is a binary that either you can live or you can enjoy life or you just leave it, then only you can enjoy spiritual bliss. No, my bhakti offers a way. My kind of bhakti, that is what Kabir is saying. My kind of bhakti offers a way where you will enjoy the moksha, the bliss, the union constantly, provided you work regularly in your praxis to maintain your self awareness.
Right. I'm reminded of, slightly on a tangent, reminded of a remarkable line by Sahir, संसार से भागे फिरते हो, भगवान को क्या तुम पाओगे?
Bhagwan
In
ko
a
kya
sense,
paoge? Yeah, that's
yeah,
point. That's the whole point.
yeah,
You see, if you do not have, for example, if you are not, if nobody is making an attempt to seduce you,
right,
how do I know that you have the self control?
right,
That's the whole
absolutely,
point.
yeah. Another point that in his Moko Kaha Dhundhere Bande, he says, खोजी होए तुरंत मिल जाऊं एक पल
पल
की
भर की
तलाश
तलाश
में
में
कहत कबीर सुनो भाई साधो मैं तो हूँ विश्वास में. Now the idea, this construct that the divine exists in one's individual faith and not in external trimmings and trappings must not have been popular in his time, right?
No, quite the contrary, it was quite popular.
Oh, really?
And
Interesting.
this is one of my major arguments in the book and in my entire work. But before
Okay,
coming to that, let me just tell you that this particular poem, this particular line in this poem is found in different recensions also. For
I see.
example, one is what you quoted, Vishwas mein, but the older manuscripts or older collections have this सब श्वासों की श्वास में,
Oh,
which
acha.
to my mind is more sound philosophically, because then the ultimate reality, or God, or Ram as Kabir would call him, or Allah, is not in the faith but in the very existence itself. सब
Interesting.
श्वासों की
Yeah.
श्वास.
Yeah.
In every breath I exist. So the very life, I permeate the very life. And Kabir says this at other place also. Sab popan ki baas. He exists in this world invisibly, just as the fragrance exists in flowers invisibly. So anyway, whether it's Viswas or Swason ki Swans, the point you are raising is this about popularity.
Right.
Mayank, it is quite fashionable these days to describe Kabir and people like him as marginalized voices. They are not. They were not. Had Kabir been really marginalized, how could we have reverential references to him as far as in Assam and Telangana present day? In Telangana, we have Bhakt Ramdas, 2 centuries after Kabir,
Right.
who claims to have been initiated by Kabir in person. Tukaram refers to Kabir with great reverence. So do the people from Gujarat, the Bhakts from Gujarat and Shankardev from Assam.
Right.
So much so that Kabir is probably the only Bhakt or only significant non-Sufi, or someone who was a Sufi then was not a Sufi because he was a constant seeker. He finds respectful mention in Abul Fazl, Ain-e-Akbari, and
Acha.
other chronicles of that kind. So similarly, again the question is, which I have written in the book also. Suppose you are really marginalized, nobody bothers about you. Then how would this legend of his dual funeral will gain ground?
Right.
I mean, he was so influential or so popular or so loved that a group wanted to cremate him in the Hindu way, the other group wanted to bury him the
Yeah.
Muslim way. Who fights on the dead body of an insignificant person here?
That's true.
You fight on the dead body of a person only if the person was so important and so popular.
Yeah.
Of course, since he was popular, since he was influential, precisely therefore, he was persecuted. You also do not persecute Mayank, an insignificant person.
Absolutely.
You persecute, whether it is 15th century or it is 21st century, the powers that be seek to persecute only the person who is influential, who is popular, and who, according to powers, makes a difference, confuses people, misguides people, quote unquote misguides people. I mean, so whether it was British imperialism or it is any government of present day, when they persecute a person for an apparently non-criminal activity, not for murder, not for dacoity, but for ideas,
Right.
you only persecute the person whose ideas are dangerous.
Absolutely.
So Kabir was revered by some people because they loved his ideas, and at the same time, as a corollary, he was persecuted by some people because they found his ideas dangerous.
Right. No, I think you're spot on. You're spot on. Kabir's bhakti, in your assessment, was a mix of rational conception of spirituality and ethics of equality and experience-based method of knowledge. That's how you describe it.
Yeah,
That
right.
sounds quite a bit like Gautam Buddha to me, does it not?
Yeah, quite a lot. In fact, again, see, one interesting thing about Kabir and many people like him is this, that this is the problem of modern scholarship, particularly because I cannot say with some authority about other societies. But there is a mismatch, fundamental mismatch between the historical reality of Indian tradition and modern attempts to interpret and understand it.
Right.
Because, for example, I'll give you an example which is there in the book also. The great French scholar Charlotte Wadville, referring to Anant Das, says that Anant Das, the hagiographer, the man who wrote the first proper life of Kabir. So Charlotte Wadville says that he described Kabir as someone who spent his early life, 20 or 30 years, in error, that is being Mohammedan.
I see.
I have written in this book that poor Anant Das never said anything of the kind. When he is saying that he is making Kabir say that I have wasted years of my life, there is no reference to his being born a Muslim or following the Islamic tradition. The reference is to Shakt tradition.
I see.
Nobody before me had noticed. But in any case, Anant Das, being a pious Brahmin, not Brahmin, but pious Vaishnav, he did not describe being born or being a Muslim as the error of Kabir. So this binary is being imposed by a 20th century scholar on 15th, 16th century India. Now coming to your question. I have written in this book that there are quite visible traces on Kabir of the influences from first Tantric tradition, Vaishnava tradition, Sufi tradition, and Nath Yogi tradition. Now, these Nath Yogis, Mayank, were actually popularized, peculiarly mixed from various sources. They were the form of Mahayana Buddhism. Nath Panth was actually a popular form of Mahayana Buddhism. They drew a lot of their ideas and practices from Mahayana Buddhism, including esoteric yogic practices, postures, and miraculous claims. This was all part of Mahayana Buddhism. So in that sense, of course, Kabir reminds you of Buddha. Kabir reminds you of many such individuals. But the point is that unlike Buddha, Kabir does not claim or does not create a sangh around himself. He does not create a community. In that sense, formal community, I mean, Panth. And as I told you, he makes it very clear, does not write it in so many words, but this is how I came to understand it, that enlightenment cannot be a moment of particular sambodhi.
Right.
In Kabir's life, this is very significant. I have written this, that in no legend related with Kabir, unlike the legends related with Buddha, there is no moment where after 12 years of tapasya or 14 years of tapasya, a moment comes and Siddhartha Gautam becomes Buddha.
Right.
Nothing of the sort. You do not find anything of the sort in Kabir. There is no particular moment where there is a Sujata ki kheer or anything like that, which makes Buddha enlightened soul, converts Siddhartha Gautam into Buddha. No.
Right.
Kabir continues to express his conflicts, his challenges, and his responses.
Yeah.
So of course he sounds like Buddha at many times, just as he sounds like ancient Upanishadic wisdom, and at times he sounds like Sufi mystics. He takes his terms, his lexicon from many sources, but the sentence he creates out of that is his own.
Yeah. Just last three things. Kabir's contrarianism was remarkable, quite like the figures from the other the Bhakti movement elsewhere, including Narsi Mehta, who predated him by several decades. And in fact, Narsi Mehta has been my lifelong passion, as you might recall.
I know that.
Yeah.
I know that.
What was the source of that contrarian quality among these great Bhakti figures?
Well, in this, I would just remind you from the book itself. I have one of the subtitles in one of the chapters is the philosopher's enlightenment and the poet's Vivek,
Right.
which starts with a quotation from Kant
Hmm.
that enlightenment is coming out of tutelage, coming out of non-age, which means taking your own decisions. I have explained it that, for example, when you grow adult, it does not mean that you have grown any disrespectful to your parents or they do not matter to you, but now you are not under their tutelage.
Right.
You are matured enough to take responsibility. You are taking your own decisions. And if you are not taking your own decisions, which then it would mean that you have not still grown up. You are still a child. So enlightenment is a kind of coming out of tutelage. I have compared this with what I call, following my guru and scholar Namvar Singh.
Hmm.
Namvar Singh has used a fantastic expression for the epistemology of these bhakts, and that is Anubhav Sammat Vivekvad.
I
If you
see.
look at all these bhakts, particularly the Nirgun bhakts, in fact, exclusively the Nirgun bhakts, or those bhakts who are at the cusp of Nirgun and Sagun like Narsi Mehta,
Right.
if you look at these bhakts, you will find that their epistemology draws not from the scriptural authority, but from everyday experience.
Exactly.
See, the fundamental problem in epistemology, as every student of philosophy knows, is the problem of proof, problem of authority. What is the proof? So, in traditional epistemology, you go back to scriptures, or even today, you go to certain points of departure, you go to Marx, or you go to Lincoln, or to Gandhi, or so anybody. These people make a very radical point here, and it's a very significant point that whatever, whosoever, whatever the authority, whatever the individual, whatever the scripture, our touchstone is experience. The
Right.
famous poem, almost extremely provocative poem by Kabir, जो तू बहमन बहमनी जाया, आन बाट काहे नहीं आया, जो तू तुरक तुरक नहीं जाया, भीतर खतना काहे न कराया. Now, if you claim a kind of primacy or a superiority because of your birth as a Brahmin,
Right.
how do you claim this? So, a Brahmin would naturally respond that on the basis of this scripture or that scripture, or this tradition or that tradition. But how would he answer to this question, which is rooted in experience? That if that is so, then you should have been born in some pure way, not in the impure way as everybody is.
Right. Right.
If you are so pure, then how did you come to this world in the typically quote unquote impure way?
Right.
Similarly, if you are a Muslim and claim to be a Muslim and therefore being true believer and others are kafirs and all that, then the most important sign of your being Muslim, that is your sunnah, circumcision, this must have been performed before you were born, but that is not.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
what this simple poem is saying is very significant, very fundamental, that all these claims of superiority are not based on any natural fact. They are not actually based by everyday experience. They are based on social and cultural constructs.
Absolutely.
So this is
You
what
know,
it is.
now, and to conclude this segment, in fact, I would engage you at some point later about the larger cultural, broader political context in a different interview. I don't want to club the two together. Let me
Yeah.
conclude this one with this question about there is a different kind of bhakti movement on in India right now.
Yeah.
Where do you think we are headed? And in the context, if you can slightly touch upon something that you are, I think, working on, the left liberal world, which has been so defensive about India's astonishing achievements from the last 2,500, maybe 3,000 years ago, that they almost reject it because they think it might be mistaken as Hindu achievement. They were, in a sense, but they are very defensive about them.
See, the problem with, to begin with, left liberal, this thing. And I have been saying this for years, including this book, that on many things, there is a remarkable but unnoticed similarity between the approach of the dominant amongst left liberal intellectuals and intelligentsia, not every one of them, but many of them, and on the other hand of right-wing Hinduism. There is a remarkable similarity. For example, right-wing Hinduism claims that Hindu tradition or Indian tradition in their own way has been a constant, a Sanatan. It has been a constant. And it has not really changed a bit, except in appearance or under duress in its content or orientation.
Right.
Many of the left liberals believe that before the British arrival, there was no history, so to say, in India. There was a kind of permanent stagnation. There was an inherent division between power and status. Power was enjoyed by Kshatriyas or ruling class and status by priestly class and all that. And there was no historical dynamism. Now, this is very interesting. Both these approaches find a lack of historical dynamism in Indian history. While if you look at Indian history, particularly at vernacular sources,
Right.
my insistence has always in vernacular, you find a tremendous churning in Indian history. So this is what is the problem. Not only, for example, achievements. I mean, for a typical right-wing person, Ramcharitmanas of Tulsidas is nothing but a restatement of Valmiki Ramayana, which it is not. Whether you agree with Tulsidas's worldview or you do not agree with it, but the fact remains that it's a remarkably original work. It draws upon the traditional Ramkatha, but it reconstructs Ramkatha in its own way. And exactly the same is true of Mahabharat by Sarla Das in Odia.
Right.
Or Gyaneswari by Gyandevji in Marathi.
Right.
So you completely ignore, while you think in terms of history of ideas, the evolutions and departures made in the period which has been described as vernacular millennium.
Right.
So vernacular millennium, quite interestingly, Mayank, quite amusingly, is seen as a great turning point in the history of Europe. When Bible is translated, the word of God is translated in vernaculars. But in India, it is seen only as a period of stagnation.
Oh, I see.
Without recognizing the significant fact that unlike in Europe, here the word of God was not being translated in vernacular. The God was being made to speak in vernacular.
Absolutely. Yeah.
There is a huge difference.
I
mean, there is in Gyaneswari of Gyandev, Arjun tells Krishna that, look here, sir, I do not understand Sanskrit properly, so please speak in Marathi. And give me Gyan in Marathi.
Right.
So the point is that unless you look at vernacular wisdom closely, with all its problems, I'm not glorifying anything.
Right.
So this is the problem with most of the left liberal discourse, but happily over last 30 or 40 years, things have changed. And many scholars, I have mentioned quite a few of them in my book, have started looking at the so-called medieval Indian history from a very different point of view. And therefore, the more popular expression for that period these days is not medieval, but early modern. That period is known as early modern period. Because these ideas which are associated with modernity can be seen in that period of Indian history, starting from 13th, 14th century, coming down to 17th, 18th century. So things are changing for better, at least in academics. But, and now coming to the contemporary or political part of your question. See, one of the great achievements of the early modern Bhakt poets was to sort of reclaim the original meaning of the term Bhakti. Bhakti is usually translated as devotion. Etymologically, Bhakti means participation.
Right.
And therefore, if you look at the poetry of Bhakt poets, God is not some superior being sitting out there on 7th or 9th or whatever cloud to whom you have to be completely submissive.
Right.
God is a friend. God is even a child. I mean, the entire Bhakti sensibility of Surdas treats Krishna either as a child or an amorous lover.
Right.
So God is someone who is very close to you. You participate with him. For example, concluding this answer, the book starts and the book borrows the title from a couplet of Kabir. कबीर मन निर्मल भया जैसे गंगा नीर पाछे लागा हरि फिरे कहत कबीर कबीर.
Right.
I do not go after him. I do not call out Ram, Ram, Ram. He utters my name. He comes after me. I mean, the present day bhakts, can they even dare imagine saying this about their whosoever they consider God and Devta? So that puts that difference in perspective.
No, this is terrific. This is riveting for me. I will just wrap it up with a little comment from Narsi Mehta, who says in Gujarati, and look at
Yeah.
the poetic and philosophical conceit of what he's saying. He says in Gujarati, "Hu khare tu kharo." He's addressing Krishna.
Yeah.
You exist because I exist.
And first to speak in Gujarati first.
Hu khare tu kharo.
Yeah.
Hu vina tu nahi.
Exactly. That's the whole point.
Hu re haish tya lagi tu re haishe. That means
That's it.
you are there until I'm around. After that,
I'll tell you.
it's over.
Mayank, let me share something very interesting with you.
Okay.
And this is from classical Sanskrit tradition. They had a philosopher in, I think, 10th or 11th century Mithila, Udayan, a great philosopher of Nyaya school, Navya Nyaya. So in one of his Stuti to Vishnu, one of his poems of supplication to Vishnu, the Acharya, the great Acharya Udayan says that yes, you control the whole world. The whole world exists because of you, and so on and so forth. But my dear Lord, never forget that in an assembly of Buddhists, your existence is proved because of me.
Wow.
I prove your existence.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
Buddhists do not believe in you. They do not believe in your existence. But because of the force of my arguments, so your existence is under my argument. So this is exactly the similar sentiment.
Absolutely. No, you nailed it. You nailed it. See, this is what I mean, Dr. Agarwal, that left liberal, they just don't get these profound aspects of what Indian civilization has been. Kshanika, for instance. Kumarila Bhatta, I'm talking about Kshanika, the life unfolds between what happens between two Kshanika. They don't know the answer to that. It is so profound 1500 years ago.
See, the problem with the left liberal discourse in India has been precisely this.
Yeah.
That we have not approached this tradition with, I won't say reverence or anything, but with critical approach, with real critical reverence. Reverence or respect does not mean blind support or blind devotion.
Yes.
But you must, the problem is that you do not even read vernacular as independent expression.
Right.
I mean, if you read, what happens, the typical approach is this, that just as you quoted Narsi Mehta and I quoted Udayan Acharya. So the typical response would be that, okay, so Narsi Mehta was following Udayan Acharya. So Udayan was original, Narsi was only a copycat.
Right.
Without taking into account the fact that Narsi Mehta probably did not have enough Sanskrit to know of Udayan. Narsi Mehta, of course, was not a native of Mithila. He was a native of Gujarat. And every similarity is not a proof of influence.
Right.
So, but similarity in such cases is certainly indicative of a cultural and intellectual environment. And this is something which is very important, which must be appreciated in the case of Indic tradition. And in Indic, I include Islam as well.
Right.
Because after 12th and 13th century, Islam becomes an inseparable part of Indian cultural discourse and Indian cultural experience. So the transformations during this period are of extreme importance for history of ideas as well as for history of society as such. For example, let me quote something from Jaisi, a little later after Kabir.
Right.
Very famous because of Padmavat. and unfortunately famous for this recent controversy on the film claiming to
Right.
be based on his epic. Now, in one of his poems, he describes the faith. So he says that the ways of reaching God are as many as the stars in firmament. But so far as I am concerned, my way of God is the way shown by Muhammad.
Hmm.
Now, the second part is okay. But the first part, looking at it strictly from a Islamic point of view, is nothing but kufr.
Absolutely. Yes.
Because according to the strict orthodox Islamic point of view, other ways can be tolerated, they cannot be described as equally valid.
Right.
You cannot say that there are as many ways to reach God, as many stars are there in the firmament, or as many pores are there on your body. सरग नखत तन रोआ
Yeah.
जेते बिधना के मारग हैं तेते.
Hmm.
From a Muslim point of view, this is a kufr. The
Yeah,
point is,
absolutely.
the point is that having said this, Jaisi did not suffer any fatwa. He did not suffer any persecution. On the contrary, he was an extremely revered practicing Sufi, unlike Kabir. So, this exciting potential of Indian cultural tradition, which is relevant not only for 21st century India but whole world, has been unfortunately missed both by the votaries of Indian culture and by the
Right.
votaries of revolution or inclusion and all that. That is
Right.
the
No,
tragic
this
aspect.
this this is terrific. On that lofty note, I think we must conclude. I absolutely, as expected, enjoyed talking to you. I had zero doubt that it would be like this, and I'm so glad we did it.
Thank you, Mayank. It was such a pleasure. I am really, really so happy having talked to you. We have never talked like this,
Yeah.
except exchange of some emails.
My personal admiration for what you're doing. India needs figures like you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And let me again say that you are the first person talking formally or reviewing the book who has noted these points,
Oh,
which
thank you.
nobody bothers to note these days
Yeah.
because people read things, in a very immediate context.
Right. Right.
Unfortunately, Mayank, you can treat as part of interview or outside the interview. I think the fundamental problem with our world today is that we are lacking in both philosophical and historical perspectives.
Yeah.